Welcome to the Futureering podcast. My name is Philip Sarek. The aim with this podcast is to highlight some of the incredible science, technology, and innovation happening in Australia, and some of the key individuals who are helping to build the future. This podcast is sponsored by Biotech. Biotech have created Enhance, Australia's most advanced and comprehensive nootropic formula. Enhance is a nootropic, or brain supplement, that combines 10 natural ingredients, including B vitamins, plant extracts, and amino acids to help support your mind each day. In particular, Enhance can help support and enhance your mental alertness, your focus and clarity, help maintain your nervous system health, and support your energy production. Enhance is also a listed medicine on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. This means that it has been formulated, manufactured, and lab tested to some of the most stringent standards in the world. Biotech also offers a 100-day, 100% money-back guarantee. So if Enhance doesn't work for you or you don't love it, you will get your money back. Listeners of this podcast can get 15% off today for Enhanced Nootropic by simply using the code FUTUREERING. Just visit www.neurotech.com.au and use the code FUTUREERING to get 15% off Enhanced Nootropic. On today's episode of the Futuring podcast, I am joined by Sam Banister, the Chief Science Officer at Psylo. Psylo is a new Australian startup company developing psychedelic-inspired molecules to help treat mental health issues. Now, this comes right after last week's announcement by the TGA that they are approving and rescheduling the use of both MDMA and psilocybin to treat specific mental health conditions. So if you're interested in everything to do with psychedelics, mental health issues, enhancing the brain, and much, much more, do not miss today's episode. Sam, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the Futuring podcast.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me on, Philip.
So I'm really keen to get stuck into this, learn more about you and what you're working on at Psylo, but let's give our listeners a bit of an introduction and a story as to sort of your journey through university, what you studied, and sort of how you ended up where you are now, if we could get into that.
Yeah, sure. Well, very, very relevant to this sort of podcast. I had a pretty long-standing interest in sort of nootropics and very broadly in plant-based medicine, the activity of natural products, and just, a whole bunch of different areas of pharmacology. So I went to uni and studied chemistry, discovered sort of pharmacology in a little bit of detail whilst I was there, and realized that the intersection of these two fields is actually known as medicinal chemistry, which was pretty exciting to me to discover, where you can sort of design new drugs and understand how drugs are actually having their activity. So ended up getting a PhD in medicinal chemistry, and then went to Stanford to postdoc for a little bit, working on sort of radiopharmaceuticals and other things, a little bit of structural biology with a Nobel laureate there. That was a lot of fun, and then some more sort of drug discovery that turned into a startup in the Bay, which was a lot of fun. Came back to Australia to head up a lab at the University of Sydney, looking at the therapeutic potential of cannabinoids.
Yeah.
And then as I was wrapping up that position, sort of kicked off Psylo with my co-founder Josh Isman, and we're really focused on the development of all sorts of next generation therapeutics, but inspired by the underlying pharmacology of natural psychedelics.
Yeah, that's incredible. May I ask, what was your thesis for your PhD when you were at U Sydney?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I can remember the exact name, but it had a pretty technical and dry sounding name, but it was really about the chemistry of this particular class of molecules that are known as polycarbocyclic amines. So there's these sort of cage molecules that have a nitrogen atom somewhere in them, and they were ligands of a particular set of proteins known as the sigma receptors. So we were looking at those for treating all sorts of different conditions. The sigma receptors are an interesting target because it's actually an off-target for a number of approved drugs, many antipsychotics, SSRIs, and other things. And as a target on its own, it's been linked to sort of analgesic effects in neuropathic pain and other sort of interesting applications.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what about your postdoc at Stanford, I believe you said? What were you working on there?
Yeah, I went over there to do the sort of further development of a tracer for neuroinflammatory disorders. So that was a ligand of the translocator protein, which is upregulated when there's sort of an insult to the brain and it's overexpressed in microglia. So really just want to get my hands dirty, seeing how you sort of smash particles together to make radioactive isotopes, then put those into different drugs and use them to image diseases in animals using a PET scanner. So yeah, did that for 2 years, learned a huge amount, and then started working with some people in Brian Kabilka's lab, looking at developing sort of novel cannabinoids, but also understanding precisely how things like THC differ from synthetic cannabinoids in terms of how they activate the cannabinoid type 1 receptor. And then after that, worked for a centre then known as ChemH, which is a translational chemistry sort of initiative that's set up to really turn a lot of the really cutting edge biology that's happening at Stanford into new therapeutic modalities. So I was working with the head of the MedChem unit there, Mark Smith, who's an amazing guy to work with, on a project that was out of Ed Engelman's lab. So Ed's mostly known for his work in immuno-oncology and has started a bunch of companies. He's a very seasoned sort of entrepreneur. And this was his first sort of experience looking at neurodegenerative disorders and sort of an immune role for those. So yeah, we developed a pipeline of molecules. It became this company called Tranquis, and as far as I know, they're still continuing to develop those molecules for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, that is super exciting. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening, I guess, with pharmaceuticals, particularly when it comes to the brain. I know recently we sort of had two things coming out with regards to sort of SSRIs and them not really understanding whether the whole serotonin model of depression, and they don't even know if that's correct, and then also the whole Alzheimer's issue with beta amyloid, and then realizing that maybe beta amyloid isn't the main reason for Alzheimer's disease. So there's a lot of interesting things that I guess we sort of haven't figured out yet that we really need to figure out.
Oh, I think someone had a crazy tally. I forget. I won't quote a specific number because I'll probably get it wrong. But the total number of billions of dollars that have been expended on the amyloid hypothesis for Alzheimer's without really delivering any successful drugs is pretty scandalous. It's a huge sum. So yeah, a lot of these hypotheses are clearly not correct, or we don't really understand enough about the underlying disease.
Yeah, that's interesting. Why do you think that is? Is it sort of just there was an initial hypothesis that beta amyloid was the main reason for Alzheimer's, and then it's sort of just everyone just sort of followed on from that and made drugs to target that, as opposed to actually thinking or finding other ways or other reasons for it?
Yeah, I think a lot of the preclinical data looked really good, and I think if you have a good hypothesis, you continue to test it and you continue to develop things, and you start doing a lot of the basic biology, move into animal models, and as long as it keeps looking okay, you've got good reason to think that it will be successful in humans. And I think it was just one of those hypotheses that continue to deliver a lot of really good basic science, a lot of really good translational science, but ultimately didn't turn out to be that impactful in the clinic, and in a way that probably was not predictable when the hypothesis was proposed, and definitely as people continue to work on it. Yeah,
awesome. So let's move on to a bit more about your current role. How did you sort of start up Psylo? You were one of the co-founders, I believe. Yeah, what was that process? Was that based on research or work you'd already done at universities, or was that a completely new idea that you thought, hey, this is a good idea, let's get a team together and build this out, or what was the process there?
Yeah, it was a bit of a good opportunity sort of at the right time. So I have been interested in psychedelics for a very long time, and I've met a number of sort of key people in the field from when I was living in the US, and I've been fascinated by just this really interesting class of drugs and their therapeutic potential. And then right as I was wrapping up my university position, met Josh, who's he's a New Yorker originally, but he's been living in Australia for many years. He's a repeat founder. He's also super interested in the space, and we realized pretty quickly that it's definitely the right time to be thinking about starting a company in this area. A number of big clinical trials had just released their sort of top line results, and we thought, there's probably some room here to come up with sort of improved drugs in terms of either greater efficacy, reducing side effects, all sorts of other improvements. So we just got to work building things pretty quickly. It's a pretty unusual origin story in that I think we'd had maybe 3 meetings before we decided down this path, and then Sydney went into lockdown, so we're actually starting the company for a number of months at the 5 kilometre radius overlap of our 2 addresses, which was this narrow little strip of park in the Moore Park area. So it was pretty unusual, pretty wild. We'd get out for our exercise and talk about psychedelics and building a company, and definitely not the way most companies are started, I don't think.
Yeah, no, I love hearing about origin stories all the time. I'm very interested, especially when it comes to something that you're doing, such as in the deep tech space, particularly biotech for you. did you go on it full time, like almost immediately? Did you go for funding? How did you navigate that?
Yeah, we started raising a bit of a pre-seed off the sort of interest in the area and the potential to have some impact with improved medicines in the space. So yeah, we got to work sort of raising right away. I was wrapping up my academic position anyway. It was just very fortuitous timing, and by the time that academic position was finished, we'd raised a pre-seed round, and I was able to jump in full time. And at that stage, it was just Josh and I in a co-working space in Surrey Hills. At our computer, directing chemistry and pharmacology from the other side of the world, and thinking about how quickly we could build a lab out somewhere in Sydney.
Yeah, that's incredible. So, I guess, was your idea sort of, look, we know there's these molecules out there such as psilocybin and other psychedelic molecules, and they may have a profound effect based on the research, but they have issues in terms of efficacy and these hallucinogenic properties potentially, and your idea was just let's see if we can create molecules inspired by those but sort of tweak them a little bit so they have greater effects or better effects depending on what you wanted. Is that sort of the thesis there?
Yeah, that's more or less it. I'd done a lot of work with two other classes of drugs that target different G protein coupled receptors. So one of those was mu opioid receptors, which are the targets of morphine and fentanyl and other things.
Yeah.
As well as the cannabinoid receptors, so the targets of THC from cannabis, as well as a number of these synthetic molecules. And in thinking about these classes for a long time, it becomes pretty apparent that along sort of structural lines, you can design different molecules that elicit some of the signaling pathways and therefore some of the effects, but not necessarily all of them. Mm-hmm. And that no one had really, the term is signaling bias. It goes by a number of other different names. Historically, it was sort of stimulus trafficking, and you'll see ligand bias and other things used as well. But the basic idea is that if you engineer a molecule precisely enough, you can sort of induce only the desirable effects that you want and maybe mitigate some of the side effects or undesirable activities. So people have done this pretty extensively in the opioid space. And there's a number of there's one drug that's been approved, I believe, and there's a couple that are in various stages of development. A little bit has been done in the cannabinoid space, but mostly to understand the basic science. And people hadn't really looked in an exhaustive way in the psychedelic space. So we had this idea that there were going to be a number of barriers to the broader deployment of these substances, and that's for those people who are listening who don't know, the current model for psilocybin from magic mushrooms, for example, as a clinical medicine, is that it is administered during a session that lasts for sort of 6 to 8 hours, the duration of the effects of the drug. But before that, you have a number of therapy sessions, kind of before and after. Yeah. And 6 to 8 hours with 2 therapists in attendance is not really going to be a treatment that's accessible to a number of different people. And as well as the fact that there's going to be a lot of people who just don't want to take a very potently psychedelic drug. So we wanted to start exploring this idea that maybe you can tease out some of the hallucinogenic effects, or maybe you can reduce the duration of action. So you have a sort of intense drug experience that's therapeutically beneficial, but it's not 6 to 8 hours. It might be 2 hours or something that's a bit more manageable.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. I think in particular with regards to sort of the whole setup, as you said, being in a clinic, having multiple psychiatrists there going through that whole process, there's a lot of inertia, I guess, in that process that you could probably, hopefully we can mitigate that and, as you said, build molecules that don't necessarily have to have that process involved. That would be cool. That would be really cool.
Yeah, we're dealing with the first generation compounds that have they're relatively safe and they're quite effective. We're now seeing, but they just have a number of drawbacks. They're products provided by nature, fascinating molecules, long history of human use, but not engineered for our purposes as drugs. And like many fields of natural product sort of derived medicine, I think there's just a lot of room for improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. So for all of us non-biotech drug development pharma type people, what is sort of the process for doing drug development, so creating these new psychedelic inspired molecules?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a process that's not super well understood, I would say, generally. It's a bit of an art and a bit of a science, some engineering thrown in, but typically you'll start with sort of a target of interest that needs to be inhibited or activated, and then you'll go looking for chemical matter that interacts with that target in a sort of known way. And in the case of a lot of the companies in the psychedelic space at the moment, the starting point might be psilocybin itself. So you start with known chemical matter. You start making systematic changes to that molecule, sort of one atom at a time almost. introducing different sort of design elements or motifs that you think will do certain things pharmacologically based on the experience of the medicinal chemist and what's known as structure-activity relationships. So then you synthesize all those molecules, you confirm that you've made them in high purity and the right structures using a number of analytical techniques, and then you start testing them in various receptor models. So this is typically a cell line that's expressing your target of interest. Sometimes you look at other off-target activities. You get a readout in terms of its potency and efficacy, and then you use that information to sort of infer these structure-activity relationships and do several rounds of sort of iterative design to get you to a compound that's starting to look like it might be suitable for putting into an animal or into a human. And then further down the pathway, you start doing those experiments in animals. So looking at how the drug's metabolized, does it actually get into the brain? Are there any sort of known toxicity issues that can be identified? What's it actually doing in various animal models of disease? And once you've survived that kind of whole process, you start a large-scale manufacture of the drug under good manufacturing practice, and make sure you've got something that's extremely well understood in terms of its purity and its sort of safety. And then that goes into a phase 1 study in humans to show that it is actually well tolerated. And from there, you then run through sort of phase 2 and phase 3 studies, and eventually marketing approval. And the amount of work and number of patients involved in each of those goes up substantially, and so do the costs. So it's compared to a lot of other areas of technology, it's a very long development timeline and a very expensive one too. It's probably, in the opinion of myself and several other people I've spoken to, it's probably one of the most complex things that humans do routinely is develop new drugs, when you think that these things cost over $1 billion to develop and can take 10 to 15 years from sort of concept to market. It's quite remarkable that we managed to do it at all.
Yeah.
How safe and effective they need to be.
Yeah, it's a crazy process, but yeah, to me it sounds so exciting. So in the beginning, are you quite literally starting in the lab engineering these molecules physically, or are you initially doing like computer simulations and modeling, and then sort of taking that and then going to the lab and beginning the process?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the process I just described, where you start with, say, a natural product or some other bit of chemical matter, that chemical matter is often, with psilocybin, obviously it's already pretty well suited for human dosing, but usually it's not. It's just a bit of chemical matter that interacts with a target and not very drug-like. So that's typically referred to as a hit, and eventually you want to get to something that's a sort of clinical lead, and so that process is known as lead optimization. Those hits can come from sort of privileged bioactive chemical space, so that's a lot of drugs that come from natural products will be found there. Historically, hits could also come from high throughput screening, so this is where you'd use really clever sort of automated approaches to make massive libraries of anywhere from tens of thousands to millions of molecule fragments, and start looking at which of those interacts with your target of interest. And then the other method you can use for finding interesting hits is the method you described computationally, so any number of virtual screening approaches. So Psylo's used both iteration from the natural products, but we've also successfully used a virtual screening campaign to develop new chemical matter that interacts with the 5-HT2A receptor, which is the main target of psychedelics. Yeah.
I was going to go deep on that next, looking at sort of mechanisms of action for psilocybin and similar psychedelics. As you mentioned, is it primarily their ability to bind to the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor, which causes all these sort of downstream effects, including the hallucinogenic properties? And is that the main mechanism of action, sort of what you're targeting with your molecules as well?
Yeah, it's well understood that so the 5-HT family, the receptors for serotonin, for 5-HT itself, 5-hydroxytryptophan. There's about 14 of them that are known. Most of them are GPCRs. There's one ion channel in there as well. And obviously serotonin itself, being the endogenous transmitter, interacts with all of them. And then different drugs interact with different populations of them. So for psychedelics, what's interesting, 5-HT2A specifically is often one of several targets for antipsychotics, for example. And these drugs typically block that site and a number of other sites. For psilocybin, it hits a bunch of different receptors. Most psychedelics, to be technically accurate, psilocybin is metabolized into psilocin, which is actually the active moiety, but hopefully people are familiar with that. So psilocin itself interacts with 5-HT2A, 2B, 2C, 5-HT1A, some of the other lesser known 5-HT receptors. LSD has sort of a similar profile, but then it will also hit some of the dopaminergic receptors. 5-methoxy-DMT, is has a preference for 5-HT1A over 2A, but actually hits a lot of other things as well. So none of these drugs are pure agonists. They're not highly selective for any one target. They actually hit a lot of them. The reason that we know that 2A is almost certainly the main psychedelic receptor is because you see a lot of that sort of psychedelic activity disappear in animal models when you do things like knock out the 2A receptor. Yeah. You also see it abolished when you block it with a known antagonist. So we're pretty confident that 2A is the primary site for this activity, but what's really interesting to a lot of people in the space who are not sort of chemists or pharmacologists in this area is that 2A is necessary but not sufficient, and this is kind of key to a lot of Psylo's program. It is possible to have something that activates the receptor but does not induce a hallucinogenic activity in humans, which I find just like fascinating. And sometimes the structural changes that go from one to the other are like a single atom or movement of a position of an atom. These truly tiny changes that lead something from being a very potent psychedelic to being completely non-hallucinogenic in humans at very high doses.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I hear some people saying that what if the hallucinogenic properties are sort of what's giving the therapeutic benefit, and if you are removing that, is that going to even have the same therapeutic benefit? Is that sort of still unknown at this stage, or?
Yeah, it's definitely unknown. The lines of evidence that suggest that in the psychedelic assisted therapy that I described before for psilocybin, where you're given a high dose, 25 milligrams of psilocybin as an adjunct to traditional psychotherapy.
Yep.
In those studies, when lower doses are given, they're not as effective in terms of treating depression, for example. Mm-hmm. And patients who have sort of subjective reports on these sort of intensity, the mystical type nature of their experience, and there's a rating questionnaire for this, but based on how profound that experience is, that also correlates with improved symptoms in depression. So we do know that how intense that psychedelic experience is does seem to correlate with therapeutic benefit.
Okay.
But in a number of animal models, obviously to get a psychedelic effect, there are a number of other different changes that are happening in the brain. At a biochemical level, you're getting upregulation of certain genes. That's leading to other signaling cascades, and you get this sort of change in synaptic plasticity, or just neuroplasticity more broadly in the brain. So that's an underlying biochemical process that's happening to drive sort of structural plasticity within the brain.
Yeah.
You also get a psychedelic effect, and we don't really know how much of each of those things is super important for that overall therapeutic effect. We know that the psychedelic effect appears to be important, at least for depression in the trials that have been run, but we don't know what happens if you remove that and just have some of these underlying biochemical changes, if that's enough to actually elicit a proper antidepressant effect. In animal models, it seems like it is.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm really interested to see that research unfold and come out in the near future. Yeah, as you mentioned, like some of the other downstream effects, I hear everything from, increases in neuroplasticity, as well as, the reduction in blood flow to what they know as the default mode network.
Yeah.
And which of these effects are like, do we know which effects are exactly responsible for those therapeutic benefits, for example, helping alleviate depression and all that, or is it still unknown?
I'd say it's all still unknown. It's very cutting edge research. There's a lot of really good work being done. The default mode network stuff, mostly by Robin Carhart-Harris and others, is super interesting, using these very modern imaging techniques, things like MRI, functional MRI, to look at what's actually going on in the brain when people take psychedelics. Yeah. But there's still a lot of sort of gaps in the knowledge in terms of how these various measures actually translate to efficacy in depression or some other condition.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of the research in general and where it's at for the more classic psychedelic molecules, psilocybin, for example, as we've been talking about, is the research really there? Because I talk to a lot of people about psychedelics and what's going to happen very shortly, and most people are still quite skeptical from what I can see. So is the research there, and is it solid in terms of, yes, certain psychedelics can help with certain mental health issues like depression in the long term? Like, is that research really solid at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of trials have been run, so there's a huge amount of anecdotal support, but that's really, anecdote. It's not data at the level that we'd like to see it. Quite a few smaller trials have been run, so looking at everything from sort of smoking cessation to people that are looking at eating disorders, generalized anxiety disorder. There's quite a few of these studies going on. Obviously, they're also quite small. But some of the larger studies have done things like compare psilocybin to SSRIs in some of these approaches. And you've got Compass Pathways about to complete, this enormous phase 3 study of their psilocybin plus therapy combination. That study, will probably have pretty close to 1,000 patients, that sort of order of magnitude, which is a very large number of patients for that style of study. And they were reporting, pretty incredible results in their phase 2 study, which had, 230 odd patients across several different treatment groups. So they were seeing, pretty reasonable reductions in depression, in major depressive disorder, and those reductions were often sustained for sort of 12 weeks out from the trial as well. So it does seem to be a pretty real and sustained effect.
Yeah, that's incredible. I'm really eager to see this all come out and unfold, because it seems just like what's needed in terms of treating mental health issues, and you can just see mental health issues are definitely on the rise, especially these days in the modern world and everything that's going on. So it's really cool to see. Let's go on to some of the exciting news that came out all over social media last week with regards to the TGA approval and the rescheduling of MDMA and psilocybin. So give us a breakdown of what happened, what was the news, and what does that sort of mean for Australia and what's going to happen in this industry.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a pretty big announcement from the TGA, who are not necessarily known for being super progressive on these sorts of matters. So the TGA has agreed that for certain conditions, when prescribed by authorized prescribing psychiatrists, that psilocybin for depression and MDMA for PTSD will actually be rescheduled from their current position as S9, controlled substances, which are, illegal controlled drugs that have no accepted medical benefit. They'll be formally rescheduled for these certain prescribing instances and certain conditions as S8 medicines, which is the same category as things like Adderall, dexamphetamine for ADD.
Yeah.
So drugs that have some sort of potential safety concerns or abuse liabilities, but are recognized as effective medicines for specific conditions. So yeah, it's a pretty big signal from our regulator, from the TGA, and I think a lot of people are justifiably pretty excited about it.
Yeah, I think I was definitely surprised and shocked to see that, and they sort of switched their stance on that, which is pretty crazy. That's really cool. Are there already companies sort of lined up to help supply these medicines to clinics and psychiatrists once this sort of regulation changes in July, whenever it is this year?
Yeah, I think there are a number of companies in Australia who will be in a position to, potentially provide materials for clinical trials and for patients. I'm not across the details on exactly who is most well positioned right now to do so. I know most of the materials for existing trials is manufactured under contract overseas and then imported into Australia specifically for the trials.
Okay.
But we certainly have facilities here, companies that are working on either extracting psilocybin from mushrooms or producing it synthetically, for example, as well as facilities who have licenses to manufacture S8 and S9 substances for clinical trials. So I don't think that will be a real barrier to actually obtaining these materials if there's enough demand for them.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, incredible times. Would there be any opportunity, do you think, then, for aspiring entrepreneurs, people who want to build startups, to sort of break into the psychedelics industry in the future once it becomes more mainstream, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's probably never been a better time to get into it. So I had been interested in psychedelics for quite a while, and I finished my PhD and actually applied for a Fulbright scholarship to go work at VCU in Virginia with a researcher there who'd done a lot of work on psychoactives in sort of areas that I was interested in. I remember at that time he was one of maybe 3 professors in the world that was actually doing any kind of psychedelics chemistry. And the Fulbright committee that interviewed me wasn't too interested in sigma receptors and other things for treating substance use disorders, so I didn't end up getting that scholarship. But I remember thinking it was, at that stage it was a tiny academic curiosity in terms of the medicinal chemistry of these substances. And that was not too long ago, 2011, 2012.
Mm-hmm.
So here we are sort of 10 years later, and over the last few years we've got clinical trials, phase 3 clinical trials going on. You've got Australia rescheduling some of these substances. The FDA has given breakthrough therapy designation to some of these substances. There's literally hundreds of companies around the world developing psychedelics and psychedelic technologies in different ways. There's more than 100 clinical trials going on with various psychedelics. So there's just this enormous amount of activity in the academic sector, and in the private space, in the startup world. Huge amounts of investment still pouring in, and I'd say it's probably never been a better time. It's everyone's pretty excited about the potential of this space for sure.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think, like, what opportunities would there be besides, like, as you said, extracting it and then supplying that to sort of the clinics and the psychiatrists, sort of doing what you're doing, which is more on the R&D side, creating novel molecules. I guess some people are probably going to look to see if there's going to be opportunity to, like, create almost consumer psychedelics brands, but I don't know if that's ever going to be the case. Do you think that we're ever going to get to a point where you can sort of either get it prescribed and purchase it online, or even over the counter type thing? Is that ever going to be the case?
I personally feel like it probably will happen. So there's interesting precedent for that in the cannabis space, and obviously these are very different drugs with different effects, and I don't think we'll get to the point so quickly where these are sort of take-home substances for recreational use. But what is interesting is that there are already sort of signals that the ability to use these substances non-medically might be tolerated in different places, and in Oregon State in the US, there's the clinics that are being set up there, for example, don't require you to have a health condition, which I thought was kind of pretty remarkable. So these are not centers for treating depression with psilocybin that's state approved. You just need some kind of observer who's there and agreed to be participating by the state and making sure that it's sort of safe and effective. Kind of an interesting move there at the state level, at least, to have sort of non-medical use being formally sanctioned. So I think there are a few other places as well around the world, Jamaica and certain other countries where these substances, psilocybin at least, and mushrooms are not illegal, and people are certainly setting up sort of various health retreats and psychedelics retreats there that focus on holistic type approaches to wellness and other things that often involve psychedelics, and that's all quite open, and there's sort of a lot of traditional sort of consumer branding going on in that space. So I think it's a matter of time.
Yeah, interesting times for sure. What are your thoughts on sort of the whole microdosing movement? Obviously, it's been a big thing, sort of started in the Silicon Valley area and sort of spread, I guess, globally, and especially in the Western world, people trying to, improve their productivity or creativity, things like that. Do you think there's any merit to microdosing? A lot of people are sort of iffy on it as well, because there's not that much research, if any, compared to sort of your larger, more macro dosing, what you see in the clinical trials and the research. Do you think there's any merit to sort of microdosing?
Yeah, I was actually living in Silicon Valley when I remember being quite shocked. This was probably around sort of 2015. I remember being quite shocked by just how openly people talk about microdosing, and you'd meet, I had friends who were like Google and Facebook engineers who were, very sort of buttoned up, straight edge people who you wouldn't think, people who barely drank and really weren't into anything too wild, who were quite happy to talk at parties and meetups about how they were microdosing something for creative flow or whatever else. So it's definitely, some of the taboo around psychedelic use is definitely removed in that area. I mean, we've spoken to investors who will happily tell you that they're microdosing right now, and I don't mean investors from the psychedelic space, but like it's truly remarkable how widespread that activity is. And like a lot of areas of research, we just don't have the data yet. There's a huge amount of anecdotal support. People will happily tell you that they feel like their mood's improved, or they get better creative states when they're microdosing, but it's there's a huge amount of expectancy bias there as well. So what's really needed, it could be the placebo effect, it could be a real effect, but what's really needed is these larger, more rigorous studies where the material provided is proper pharmaceutical grade material. The studies are blinded to the participants and the people running the trials, and just to collect some of that really rigorous data. That's kind of what's needed here. And some of those studies are going on right now. So there's one happening at Macquarie University by an academic there named Vince Polito, who's looking at whether not truly microdose, around 5 milligrams of psilocybin, I think, is the treatment, but 5 milligrams of psilocybin 3 times a week can treat moderate depression in young males. So not a full psychedelic dose, probably not a true microdose in that it might be slightly perceptual, but it's a very rigorous study that's being run like any other clinical trial.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, what's interesting to me is, like, obviously psychedelics hold great potential for helping solve some of these really major mental health issues we're seeing: PTSD, depression, addiction. But then, yeah, there's also the other side, which is probably going to happen later down the track in terms of boosting creativity, coming up with novel solutions. I think that'll be interesting, especially for myself as an engineer. Like, I want to be able to think creatively, come up with new ideas. And I feel like that could just be a sort of way to catalyze and accelerate sort of innovation globally. I think there was one really interesting study I read a while back where I think they got a bunch of participants, a mixture of engineers, mathematicians, and physicists, to come with like their hardest problem that they couldn't solve at work, and then I believe they gave them peyote or something similar, and it was something like 80% of them were able to come out with like a novel solution to their problem, which is just mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, I know the study you're talking about. I don't recall any, more of the details than you do, but it was it was certainly an interesting idea around this concept of like improved creativity. And if you have a look at sort of the history of scientific discovery, even I guess even just other areas of sort of tech development, there's no shortage of people who very publicly credit psychedelics with giving them a certain inspiration or helping them resolve a certain idea. And the few that come to mind are Carrie Mullis, who discovered polymerase chain reaction that we used obviously very widely during the COVID pandemic.
Yeah.
In his autobiography, he talks very explicitly about how he came up with the concept for that after this LSD trip and driving through a redwood forest in California. Like, it's something he'd been thinking about for a long time, didn't really have a clear solution, and got this flash of inspiration after taking this pretty high dose of LSD up somewhere in the desert in Central California, I think. I think Steve Jobs has talked about his experimentation with LSD. There's certainly plenty of people in the tech world, and if you go far enough, there's I'm trying to think of the name of the book, but there's a certain book that proposes that maybe the very birth of Silicon Valley came about because a lot of other drugs were being screened in terms of employment-based drug testing, but psychedelics weren't detectable at that particular time. So basically, the only people left in the tech workforce were actually people who were using psychedelics, but not cocaine or stimulants or or whatever. I think it's probably not quite true, but it's an interesting idea anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I heard even everyone knows the whole Steve Jobs thing. That's sort of like where he came. Everyone says that's where he came up with the idea for Apple and all that, which is interesting to think about if that was the case. But I think I even heard Watson and Crick came up with the idea for the double helix of the DNA, sort of whilst taking. I don't know if that's true, but I heard that could be
that's
a possibility as well.
I'm not sure how factual that one is, but it's certainly made its way into urban legend that it's that was inspired by psychedelic use as well. I mean, you have to remember these were drugs that were legal for a period, then explicitly illegal for a long while, and are now in sort of various stages of being modified in terms of their regulation. So you have to assume that the stories that you hear very publicly are only a fraction of the stories that were actually taking place, and there's not even a shortage of very public stories where people are accrediting certain discoveries to immediate insight following psychedelic use.
Yeah, definitely. So are these molecules able to modify and increase neuroplasticity, so actually change and modify brain pathways? And is that why we think it can possibly alleviate things like depression?
Yeah, that's one of the sort of prevailing hypotheses, is that following psychedelic use you get a number of different changes in the brain, and I think, as I mentioned before, these range from sort of very early on changes in gene expression, and typically along the lines of genes that are associated with things like memory, long-term potentiation of memory and other things. And then over the next several days, you continue to get changes in signaling, various signaling pathways, and expression and activation of different proteins. So there seems to be this sort of really temporal aspect and a bit of a latency to some of these sort of changes that are happening in like a pharmacological sense following psychedelic use. And this has been observed in a number of sort of in vitro cultures, and in some cases in live microscopy imaging, that you do actually get these really pronounced structural changes in the neurons, the way that they're connected, the way that they're functioning. So yeah, it's certainly plausible that you are kind of functionally remodeling the brain in useful ways, beneficial ways. Yeah,
it's super interesting. I wonder, there's all those theories as well about like whether or not humans sort of co-evolved with psychedelics, and there's the whole stoned ape theory. Like, did our brains grow significantly because we were using these things, and they led to those certain brain changes, and it sort of sped up the evolution, I guess, the human brain? That's interesting. I mean, I don't think there's any evidence to support that theory, but It's cool to think about.
No, yeah, that's Terence McKenna, and
Yeah.
he's received a lot of credit for the whole stoned ape hypothesis. I don't know if it's necessarily true, but there's a competing theory by a guy named Ronald Siegel, who's got a book called Intoxication that's great, and it covers the fact that essentially the drive for intoxication or for the ingestion of psychoactive substances is actually a universal biological drive, and he proposes like a lot of different cases where this is true, from sort of elephants getting drunk off fermented fruit to starlings doing the same thing, and then a bunch of them sort of flying into windows and dying during these mass migrations. And so it seems like, you know, in terms of intoxication is this behavior that at its surface seems really maladaptive for the environment. It's almost certain to put you in a greater state of danger, and you know, it seems like it really runs counter to evolution. But the important thing is that within a population of animals, at least, it's never all members of a particular species that are doing this. It's always some fraction of them.
Yeah.
And Siegel sort of proposes that maybe, despite appearing very maladaptive for the species as a whole, for the group, having a few sort of crazies on the fringe that are willing to take these substances and do wacky things is actually a really innovative way to get sort of new behavioral patterns into a population of animals or a species. So there's that sort of argument as well, that really it's you know, it's an interesting adaptation strategy for sort of fringe members of a species that confers benefits more broadly.
Yeah. Yep, there's a lot to discuss there. It's
Yeah.
very, very interesting stuff. What I'm super keen on is sort of, I think having psychedelics hopefully is a solution for people with treatment-resistant depression or suicidal ideation, things like that. I think is super important. I think suicide's like on the rise as well, and I know a few people personally. It's just like, I feel like if that was a potential solution for them at that time, like it could be game-changing. You know, it could completely change your state of mind and reframe your perspective on the world, and, you know, keep people alive, which is super valuable, I think.
Yeah, and in the Compass sort of treatment-resistant depression trial, I mean, these are people who, by definition, have failed a number of first-line treatments already. So these are truly, you know, people with some of the most serious depression on earth. A lot of them are sort of suicidal in various cases, and I think it's important that the studies have looked at those particular groups where you have the sort of most desperate patient population. You're likely to see the greatest effects, but also, you know, provide the greatest benefit more broadly if these things are approved as medicines.
Yeah, definitely. So, when you started Psylo, did you already have sort of contacts that were willing to sort of invest in that idea, or was it easy enough to say, hey, we've got this great idea, we've got a team, we know what we're doing, and then you just go out to the investment community and seek investment? Because I know a lot of people want to create their own startups, to build their own thing, cool technology using cool science, but it's sort of, they're either scared, there's a bit of fear, they don't know how they're going to get money, whether it's possible. But I feel like there's a lot of opportunity out there, especially now in terms of getting funding, even getting grants by the government support, all that kind of stuff. So what was like, how difficult was that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I was sort of surprised. I really let Josh lead a lot of that early on, and I was very skeptical about being able to raise in Australia, you know, in the biotech space from sort of a concept stage company, being able to raise money from the biotech VCs themselves, or even from other sort of deep tech VCs, just because of how early things were. And I was pretty pleasantly surprised that because of the enormous potential in this space, because a lot of people have a very personal connection to psychedelics or to mental health more broadly, we were actually able to raise from a number of different groups. So these included, you know, pretty solid angel list from people that had a certain personal interest. We had quite a few deep tech VCs who were just more broadly interested in the space and biotech. I'm trying to think who else was in the pre-seed round. Probably a mix of angels, deep tech VCs, and sort of generalist VCs who were just interested in the space. But that was what really sort of made up our pre-seed. And by the time we closed our seed round, we also brought some sort of biotech VCs to the table. In the pre-seed and seed, also some psychedelic specializing VCs as well, which is, I was surprised to learn is actually a thing. So there's kind of more than a dozen VCs around the world now who exclusively focus on psychedelics and psychedelic adjacent areas, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is super interesting. But yeah, it's good to know that there is support out there for things like this, things that can benefit humanity, which is awesome. What do you think is sort of the future of, this is a broad question, but the future of sort of biotechnology in terms of, one, helping solve these issues in terms of like solving diseases, mental health, physical health issues, but also in terms of optimizing human health, longevity, performance? Is it developing more novel drugs? Is it other technologies such as gene therapies? Is one going to take over the other, or are they going to be done at the same time? Is it nanotechnology? What do you sort of see as like where things are going?
Oh, it's a very hard question to answer, and I think what I like a lot about biotech is that there'll be no shortage of solutions. There's you've got some of the world's most clever people thinking of really creatively about how to solve some very pressing needs in medicine and health. If you look at things like drug approvals, biologics, so sort of engineered peptides and proteins, were not really a class of drugs. It was not that long ago that these weren't possible as drugs. So there's this idea in medicinal chemistry of sort of undruggable chemical space, and this is often things that we can't design small molecules or proteins for, and even a lot of those areas of undruggable chemical space are becoming increasingly druggable. So like we continue to get better and better at doing these things. Things like mRNA vaccines, which were a hypothesis and a lot of engineering only 15 years ago or so. There's a good a good 15 or 20 years of engineering the technology to enable the safe delivery of mRNA to have a sort of therapeutic effect. That's now a relatively new technology in terms of its approval, with a long sort of development timeline, but we're only at the very beginning of just seeing what else that technology might be capable of. And that's sort of happening more broadly in areas of sort of genetic and cellular engineering, entirely new modalities. And then you throw on top of that all of the sort of bioanalytical techniques that are being developed, various bits of software that are capable of, software and devices that are capable of monitoring your physiological state in real time, and all of the data that's being collected there, and that can then inform all sorts of ideas that we might have around early disease detection, longevity, everything else. So yeah, I think at any given day, there's probably never been a better time to be alive in the history of the planet in terms of how much potential there is for you as an individual to have a really long, healthy and productive life.
Yeah, it's such an amazing field. It really is. I'm definitely very interested in sort of the peptide side of things as well, especially coming from the cognitive enhancement background. You see a lot of people experimenting with a lot of these different peptides, and just the different targeted effects that they can have is very interesting. But what I'm thinking is, are we ever going to get to a point where you can go to a doctor or to a pharmacy and get certain drugs for the purposes of enhancing a certain function? Because obviously right now it's all just based on, you have a disease or you have some illness and this is to treat that thing, because that's what the research is based on. There isn't any research on these drugs really for enhancing you beyond baseline. And are we going to get to a point where that's even possible to purchase these drugs or peptides or therapies from legitimate sources?
I think there absolutely will be, and it's just the form in which they're sort of marketed. So the issue is that there's no precedent for registering a drug product with any major medical regulator explicitly for the purpose of enhancement. It's all, the language around drug approvals is all phrased in terms of improving disease. So there's just no regulatory pathway for it. But that doesn't mean that you have, you get things like modafinil approved for narcolepsy historically, and then of course people realize that maybe even healthy people can take this to stay awake and stay more focused on work, and I think a lot of it just becomes off-label use. So I'm not sure if, unless we change the way that we actually approve drugs and regulate them, there's unlikely to be a regulatory pathway specifically for, say, improved memory or something else, but you might get a completely new class of drug for treating cognitive impairment in Alzheimer's disease that people realize works perfectly well on healthy people as well, and that becomes an off-label use of that drug. So even if there's no formal regulatory pathway, I think there's enough sort of interested people and biohackers and things out there that you'll absolutely just see off-label uses of all of every sort of class of drug that appears in the next as many years.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how that all unfolds. Because it'd be cool to get to a place where sort of we have these options to sort of enhance ourselves beyond baseline. I mean, that's sort of the futurist side of me, just thinking about all the cool stuff.
We do it already, right? In sports, people talk about sort of performance and image enhancing drugs, and there's this strange taboo around that as a concept, which I always found just sort of morally very interesting. That somehow we can agree that using steroids to enhance the body for strength is somehow unfair, but other ergonomic aids are not. So if you're a runner, you're allowed to use starting block, a starting block, but not steroids. Like it's kind of funny that we set some technologies as entirely apart from others.
Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. All right, I want to do one final question with regards to, would you have any advice for someone say that was in your position a few years earlier, who's interested to maybe go into biotechnology and drug development, or become a scientist and sort of get into sort of the field where you're at right now, what advice would you have for someone in that position? Maybe they're about to start uni or trying to think about what they want to study at uni. Should they go through uni and study what you did and do a PhD and all that, or are there other pathways they can take?
Yeah, I think these days, the pathway is probably not as prescriptive as it once was. I would say, I've obviously spent a great deal of time at uni. Beyond the things that I learned immediately to serve my career, I feel like it was a really great experience overall for sort of social aspects, for networking, for just broader education. So I think if you have the opportunity to go, you absolutely should. If you have the opportunity to join a sort of tech-focused startup that doesn't necessarily require an advanced degree, or maybe even an undergrad degree, that is for the right startup, that's probably another really excellent place to learn a bunch of really interesting things. But I would say probably just follow your scientific interests and curiosities. It's technology generally, like scientific discovery is moving so fast that having a career goal that's 10 years out is probably not actually that helpful, because a whole bunch of really interesting stuff's going to emerge in the interim. So have a bit of a general path, but just really follow your scientific curiosity and whatever takes your interest.
Yeah, awesome. I love that. All right, so just to close off, is there anywhere our listeners can go to find out more about you, or if they want to learn about the work you're doing at Psylo, is there anywhere they can go to check that out?
Yeah, we'll be publishing a few patents and papers this year, I believe. We're presenting at a few different conferences that are around the place in Australia and elsewhere. There's a big psychedelics meeting in Denver, for example, in June that's going to be pretty amazing. There's a few health-focused events, mostly in Melbourne actually, over the next several months in Australia. Our website is at psylo.bio, so that's psylo.bio. We have a newsletter sort of curated by our comms officer, Talara Pachechi, who's also a PhD neuroscientist. So that's a pretty great place to check out what we're up to and what's going on in the field more broadly. And you can definitely find us online on sort of Twitter, on LinkedIn, and on other social media platforms, doing podcasts and talking about science and doing other fun things.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, definitely urge anyone listening to go check out Psylo. You guys are doing some really cool stuff. It's really cool to see new Australian companies sort of supporting the space, creating hopefully breakthrough therapeutics and psychedelic inspired molecules. So I'm keen to follow along on your guys' journey. And yeah, thank you for taking your time and joining me on today's podcast. I had a great time. It's super interesting to just chat about all this stuff. So yeah, look forward to following your journey.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for the chat, Phil. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Sam. Appreciate it. See you later.
Bye.